So today you have got an assessment to do. So you're going to have one full question, that's part A, B, C and D, and it's on this topic of arguments for the existence of God. So well done, those of you, you've already sent me some of your work on your revision lesson for this, just going through all 8 sections of this unit. And I'm going to go through them quickly today as well. So hopefully you'll be able to pause it, go over stuff that we've looked at each week, each lesson, go back over your notes from those lessons, and hopefully that'll really consolidate the stuff that you've learned this unit. Obviously, you've done most of it on your own at home, so well done, and I'm hoping this will help to just piece it all together. And then at the end of the video, I'll show you a reminder of how we answer the exam questions, and then I'll put the questions up. But I've also attached those as a Word document as well. And you've got roughly half an hour to do that question, obviously a little bit more if you've got extra time. We'd like you to do it without looking at notes. We'd like you to do it in the time. Obviously, we can't enforce that in any way. But please get those answers to us by the end of the week, and we can mark them and give you some really good feedback on this unit and how well you've understood what we've done. So the first bit of context to set here is to remember that every single one of this unit, all the way from religious experiences, miracles, design and cosmological argument, religious upbringing, all of it is trying to answer the question, does God exist? And is there enough evidence? Is there any proof that would help us to answer that question? Is there anything that suggests that God does exist or God doesn't exist? And which of the arguments is the most convincing? So let's go through these. I'm going to try and go through them all quite quickly, but feel free to pause, make notes, go back over stuff if anything doesn't make sense to you. So the first section that you looked at in this unit was called Revelation. And revelation is a type of religious experience. So we'll look at religious experience later on. Revelation is one type of religious experience, and it's where Christians, in this case, but it appears in other religions as well, believe that God reveals himself to humans. And that might be that God reveals himself directly to humans. So God speaks, they hear his voice, and it might be that God reveals himself indirectly to humans, so through angels or through sacred texts. So it might be that they hear him, or they see him, or they learn something new, and that's really what revelation means, that it's gaining some new understanding or new wisdom or new knowledge about God. And this revelation would be counted as proof that God exists, because if God can reveal himself, then God does exist. And there are reports of revelation in the Bible, so all the way back in the Old Testament and in the New Testament as well. And Christians believe that God still reveals himself to people today. And as I hinted at earlier, revelation is not just something in Christianity, so it exists in religions like Islam as well. So we're going to look at 3 ways that Christians believe God has revealed himself. The first one is through prophets, the second one is through the person of Jesus, and the third one is through religious experiences today. So remember, in your exam questions, you're going to need to give sources of wisdom and authority. And although we're going to look at lots of different types of sources of wisdom in this unit, the Bible is still a key one. So in Hebrews, which is one of the books in the New Testament, it says, long ago, God spoke to our ancestors in many and various ways by the prophets. But in these last days, he has spoken to us by a Son, whom he appointed heir of all things, through whom all things were created. So let's look at that first bit. Long ago, God spoke to our ancestors in many and various ways by the prophets. And so this is talking about the Old Testament, so the time before Jesus. And there are lots of prophets in the Old Testament. So prophets are kind of messengers for God. They're people that God spoke to directly, and then it was the job of the prophets to pass that message on to everybody else. One of those is Noah. So a lot of you probably know the story of Noah's Ark, and we looked at this in class as well. And Noah had a direct revelation from God. So God spoke to Noah, told him to build this ark, told him to gather up 2 of every animal, and told him that he was going to bring this flood upon the earth. So God spoke directly to Noah. We looked as well at the story of Abraham, who's considered kind of the father of monotheistic religions like Christianity, Islam, and Judaism. And Abraham had this revelation from God, where God said, look at the stars, you will have, your descendants will be as many as the stars. And so Abraham heard the voice of God, and kind of had this relationship with God where he directly communicated with him. Another one that we looked at is Moses in the Old Testament, and we're going to come back to Moses a little bit later on as well. But Moses heard the voice of God. God spoke to him. He commanded him to go and set the Israelite people free who were slaves in Egypt. And that's a story you've probably heard before as well. So all throughout the Old Testament is this kind of story of God speaking to people directly, and those people are known as prophets. So, bit of a problem with the slides. Okay, so in the middle of that source of wisdom I showed you earlier, it says that in the last days, that's talking about the time since Jesus, he has spoken to us by a son. And so that's referring to Jesus. If you remember the stuff you did in paper 1 about the Trinity, Christians believe God has 3 parts: God the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. And actually the 3 points about Revelation today we could split into those parts. That the prophets, God the Father spoke directly to them. The second way that God revealed himself is in the person of Jesus. So we talked in class about revelation through Jesus, and the way that Christians believe Jesus showed what God is like. So Jesus revealed the nature of God. Christians, of course, believe that Jesus was God in human form, and that's what they mean by incarnate. So there are many ways that Jesus could reveal something of what God is like, and that is through the birth of Jesus, the miraculous birth of Jesus, the life of Jesus, which could include his teachings, but also his actions. So things like the Sermon on the Mount, the Golden Rule, where he tells people to love their neighbor, but also through the miracles that he did, healing miracles, feeding of the 5,000, revealing God's compassion and care and servanthood through the actions of Jesus. And then finally through the death and resurrection of Jesus, which reveals something about God's power and God's salvation to Christians. So the last bit is today, how is God revealed to Christians today? So Christians believe that they have the Bible, so they have all of this stuff from the prophets. They also have the life of Jesus to look at, the teachings of Jesus, but they believe that God is revealed today through the Holy Spirit, the third part of the Trinity. So through prayer, through religious experience, they can actually have a direct communication with God, and God might reveal things directly to them, like he did to the prophets, like he did through Jesus. Okay. The second unit that we looked at in this section was visions, and visions is another type of religious experience. A vision is something that is seen, but it doesn't mean it's literally or physically seen in day-to-day life. It could be through a dream or a trance. It says in the syllabus through religious ecstasy, and it's something that gives a religious message to somebody. So the people who see visions are called visionaries. And again, this goes back all the way to the Old Testament. You could say that Abraham's revelation was through a vision. There are lots of other people in the Bible who are said to have visions of God or of angels. If you think about the start of Jesus' story, an angel appears to Mary. We think about that in the Nativity at Christmas time. So an angel appears to Mary and tells her this message, and that would be considered a vision because she saw something. And all throughout that story of the Nativity, there are angelic visitations, and God speaking to people in dreams, and all of that can be considered a vision. There's a source of wisdom that the exam board has recommended, and we haven't looked at this a great deal, but it's from Matthew chapter 17, and it's called the Transfiguration. And it's a really strange story. It's when Jesus, he goes up onto a mountain on his own to pray, and then his followers look at him, and he appears in this bright light, and next to him are two Old Testament prophets. I can't remember who they were, Elijah and somebody else. I don't know how the disciples knew that that's who they were, but the story says that Jesus appeared in this kind of glowing way with these two prophets who kind of had died hundreds and hundreds of years before, and they appeared. So visions are something that appear all through the Bible and through Jesus' lifetime as well. And then there's some really interesting examples that you could use as well. So something that fits in with your unit that you did on pilgrimage is Saint Bernadette of Lourdes. And Saint Bernadette was a young girl, I think she was 12 or 13, when she started having visions of the Virgin Mary in this cave in Lourdes, which is in France. And she had 18 visions altogether. And each time the Virgin Mary kind of gave her a message. And in the last vision, a spring of water appeared where she had been standing, and it's that water is considered to be holy water. People believe that it has healing powers, and that's when it became a place of pilgrimage. Another famous person who had visions was Joan of Arc. So there's a theme here. If you look at Mary, the mother of Jesus, Saint Bernadette of Lourdes, Joan of Arc, all young women. So perhaps you're in the right time of your life to have a vision like this. Joan of Arc was given a vision about how to defeat the enemy during a battle, and that's a really interesting story that we looked at in class. So obviously there are some more up-to-date thoughts about what visions are, and these would be considered kind of divergent views within Christianity, but more so outside of the religion, as an explanation as to why people might have a vision that doesn't need a God. And so some people would say that visions are actually hallucinations that are caused perhaps by medical conditions or by stimulants. So certain drugs have hallucinogenic powers and cause people to see things that aren't really there. But also if people have brain tumours in a certain part of their brain, that can have that effect as well. They could be natural, kind of unexplained events that are caused in nature, or coincidences, or it might be that the witnesses who say these things happen are lying, or they're mistaken. They're trying to get attention for something. So there are lots of criticisms of visions, but some people say they are evidence of a God. The third unit then that we looked at in this paper is miracles. And I want you to really spend a bit of time looking at this one because it does come up in your assessment. So a miracle, it's important to get the definition right, is something which seems to break the laws of science and therefore makes you believe that only God could have done it. So we do use the term miracle in kind of everyday life, and we talk about modern miracles or everyday miracles. People talk about childbirth as being a miracle. But in this context, we're talking about something that breaks the laws of science, so something impossible happening. And so that's why it's considered to be evidence that God exists. So there's lots of sources of wisdom for this, of course. Throughout Jesus' life, he's said to have performed miracles. And there's one part in the Gospel of John where Jesus says to his disciples, unless you people see signs and wonders, Jesus told him, you will never believe. So this suggests that Jesus had to perform miracles in order to prove that he was God. And so a lot of Christians would say that miracles are evidence that God is real, and that miracles happened in the Bible, but also that they happen today. So again, if we go all the way back to the Old Testament, we talked about Moses earlier, and there's a really famous miracle of when Moses had done what God asked him to. He'd set free the slaves in Egypt, and they're running away from the Egyptians, and they get to this sea, and there's no escape. And God tells Moses to raise his staff, and he does it. And when he does that, the sea parts, and it makes a gap for them to walk through unharmed. Again, lots in the Old Testament that we looked at in class, so have a look over those in your own time as well. And then miracles in the New Testament. So of course it starts with a miracle in the story of Jesus' birth, because it says that Jesus was born of a virgin, which, as we know, that breaks the laws of science, so that's a miracle. But also throughout Jesus' life, he is said to have performed miracles. So his first one was at a wedding, and he turned water into wine. So again, breaking the laws of science. There's one famous one where there are 5,000 people who are listening to him speak, and there's no food. So Jesus tells his disciples to look for some food, and all they can find is a little boy who's got a packed lunch. He says he'll share it, and it's just 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. And they bring it to Jesus, and he breaks it. He blesses it first. He asks God to bless it. He breaks it up, and they share it out. And it says that all 5,000 people were full, and there were 12 baskets of food left over. So again, it breaks the laws of science. And then the story of Jesus kind of ends with a miracle as well, with the resurrection, so coming back from the dead. And the big question is, do miracles still happen? Most Christians believe that they do, although they would say they are unusual events, and they have to be unusual events because that's what makes them special. So we talked about pilgrimage to Lourdes, which is usually a place of pilgrimage for Catholic Christians. The Vatican, which is where the Pope is, kind of makes the rules for Roman Catholicism. They have only validated, I think it's 63 miracles that happened at Lourdes. And the reason for doing that is to say these are not everyday events. They are unusual events. They're special events, and they should be considered, amazing and unusual. So there are differences in opinions about how often miracles happen and how often God would perform miracles. There are branches of Christianity like Pentecostalism and the Charismatic Church that would say miracles are everyday, and that a main feature of their worship on a Sunday is to pray for people to experience a miracle. And if you remember in class, we watched a video and it was of people who went to a Pentecostal church, and you saw a lot of people being prayed for, people kind of falling over. They believed that was the power of the Holy Spirit, and they believed they were experiencing God. And there were a few people on there who said that God had healed them from chronic pain, like back pain, and that sort of thing. So Christians do believe miracles still happen today, even if they are unusual. Obviously, the divergent views would come from science and atheists or humanists, which humanism's a non-religious worldview. They would say that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and they would say that there isn't scientific evidence that miracles happen, and they would put them down to kind of unexplained things. There was a philosopher called David Hume, and you could use this as a source of wisdom as well. And he said that you can't take personal experiences or personal testimonies as proof or evidence for everything, because for every person that says this amazing thing happened to me, there's another person that says, oh, this thing happened to me because of another reason. So someone might say, God healed me from this disease, and someone else would say, well, I took this medicine and it made me better. So he says personal experience can never be proof. It needs to be scientific. There needs to be scientific evidence. Okay, so religious experience is a topic on its own as well, but it does include things like visions, revelation, and miracles. So all the things we've looked at so far are considered religious experience. There are different types of religious experiences. So you could have somebody saying they've heard the voice of God, or they've seen a vision of God or an angel. Somebody could say that a miracle happened to them, or they prayed for something to happen and it was answered. Religious experiences can also be, there's something called numinous, so a feeling of awe and wonder. So you could be, I don't know, on a mountain on a really clear night and there's no light pollution, and you look up at a night sky and you see all the stars, and it's that feeling of feeling very small, and the universe being so big, and it inspires awe and wonder. And that is sometimes considered a religious experience as well. So religious experience covers all sorts of things. So some people believe God exists because they feel they've actually experienced God, which means he must exist. Religious experiences indicate a God who's active in the world. So many Christians desire religious experience. So one question that kind of runs throughout this, as well as does God exist, is if God exists, what kind of God is it? What is the nature of God? And so what religious experience says is that God's nature is to be involved and active in the world. If God makes miracles happen, then God is involved in the world. If God is answering prayers, then God is involved in the world. So religious experience. We looked earlier at the story of Moses, and Moses' revelation started with a religious experience where he heard God's voice, but he also saw a vision, and his vision is recorded in Exodus, and it says that he saw a bush on fire, but it wasn't burning up. And then he went closer and he heard this voice of God, and he has a conversation with God. We looked at a philosopher called William James, who tries to explain what a religious experience is. Now, William James is not a Christian philosopher. He's not trying to argue the existence of God, but he's just trying to say, what do we mean by religious experience? So I think it's really helpful to use William James when you are talking about religious experience. He called religious experiences mystical, which means that it's something that creates a unity or a oneness with God. So if you think about revelation, it's about a communication between God and humans. And so a mystical experience is something that brings humans and God together. And he said you can summarize religious experience by looking at 4 features. He says that they are always passive, which means they happen to you and you can't really control it or make it happen. He says that religious experiences are ineffable, so they can't be explained using human language. They are noetic, so they teach you something new, and that's what revelation means, isn't it? That you learn something from it. And they're transient, which means they don't last for very long. So some religious experiences might be minutes long, but they might have long-lasting effects. You can remember those by thinking about having a pint with William James. That's what I like to think about, having a pint with William James. Passive, P, ineffable, I, noetic, N, transient, T, pint. Again, you can use that quote from Carl Sagan, who was an astronomer: extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. What is the evidence of religious experience? Are we just trusting people that they really did feel that, or they really did see that, or they really did hear that? And is that enough to prove the existence of God? Again, we could look at scientific understandings of why people experience these sorts of things. So is it a hallucination? Is it created in a natural way that we just can't explain yet? Or are people actually making it up or lying? Okay, coming on to prayer. Now, prayer is a topic that kind of overlaps a few units. You talked about prayer in paper 1, Christian beliefs. And we're looking at prayer now as one of the arguments for the existence of God. So what it really means by this is our prayers answered, and is that enough evidence that God is listening to prayers and therefore God exists? So prayer is communication with God, and it can be used as a way of deepening a person's faith or showing worship, and that's how we've talked about it in the past. And we know there are lots of different types of prayer. So prayer might be used to praise God. It might be used as a way to thank God, to show gratitude for things that are good in a person's life. Some Christians might use prayer as a confession. So they tell God the things that they're sorry about and ask for God's forgiveness. people might pray for other people, for example, for them to get better or for them to be comforted. And that's called intercession. Or of course they might pray for something for themselves, so something that they want or they need, or help that they would like. I've put some pictures there of Bruce Almighty, which is a bit of a dated reference. I don't know how many people have seen it, but if you haven't, you can just look for some clips on YouTube, because the whole premise of the film is that Bruce gets God's power, but there are some rules that come alongside it. One scene in this film is where Bruce is hearing all of these prayers from everybody, and he just can't deal with all of these requests, and he just thinks, well, just give everyone what they want. So he says, yes, I'm going to answer all the prayers, yes. And actually it just goes really wrong, because, for example, thousands of people have prayed that they'll win the lottery, and then everyone wins the lottery, and so they only win like a couple of pence each. And he starts to realize that you can't always get what you want, and you can't give everybody what you want. And I think that's kind of summarizes what some Christians might think about prayer. There's a source of wisdom that you could use here, which is from 1 John 5. It's the one that's recommended in the syllabus. And it says, this is the confidence we, and it's talking about Christians, have in approaching God, that if we ask anything according to his will, he hears us. So Christians believe that God is listening, that God can see everything, that God is everywhere. And so whenever they pray, they believe God is listening to them. And that God wants to answer their prayers. So they pray believing that God will answer them in some way, shape or form. And so for many Christians, an answer to prayer is proof or confirmation for them that God must exist. Because if someone prays for something and they feel it's answered, then it leads to them believing in God, that God is listening to their prayers. So for example, they need a new job, and they pray, God help me get a new job, and then the next week they are offered a job or a promotion. They would see that as confirmation that God must exist. But in the same way, the opposite is true, isn't it? Because if someone prays for something and they feel that it's not been answered, then it might lead them to doubt the existence of God, because they might think, well, God wasn't listening, or God was listening but didn't want to answer my prayer, and it would make them doubt either God's existence or God's goodness. So again, it comes back to, if God exists, what is God like, and is God loving and caring and kind? Does he want to answer those prayers? Is he able to answer those prayers? And so if those prayers remain unanswered, then people might see that as the nature of God as well is called into question. If God does not answer prayers, is God listening? Does God care? Or is it that God doesn't exist at all? But there is an in-between, which is that maybe God exists, but God doesn't always answer prayers. And so Christians do have an argument, a counter-argument to that, which is that there's lots of reasons why God might not choose to answer somebody's prayer. And I think, again, the film Bruce Almighty is trying to answer that question. Why would an all-loving God and an all-powerful God leave some prayers unanswered? One of the answers is free will, that God wants people to do things for themselves, to show compassion to each other, and to help each other. And if God answered every prayer, then maybe humans would stop looking out for each other. But also Christians would say that God is all-knowing and has reasons beyond our understanding for not answering prayers. God also wouldn't answer a prayer if it was a selfish prayer, or if it was a prayer that was against kind of the nature of God. So if you prayed for something bad to happen to somebody, for example, that would be against the nature of God. God maybe would answer prayers, but not in our timing or in the way that we would expect. And so I think if I take you back to that source of wisdom that we started with from John, it says this is the confidence we have in approaching God, that if we ask anything according to his will, he hears us. And I think that would be the counter argument for Christians, is that they should be praying in keeping with the will of God. So they should be praying for the things that they know God already wants to do. And that's what Christians often mean by being in the kingdom of God, that they're trying to establish God's way of doing things on earth. So if their prayer lines up with what God already wants to do, then God will answer that prayer. And there's all sorts of things that we could say about that, but we haven't got time. So we're coming in within the second half of this unit now. Hopefully I've gone on a little bit, but it won't go over the hour of your lesson. So these arguments you looked at quite recently, and this is the kind of much more philosophical part of the unit. And we looked at two philosophical arguments. The first one is the design argument, and the philosopher behind that is William Paley. And what he said is that the world appears to have organised and intricate parts that serve a purpose or a function. And these things that we could call design elements, therefore suggest a designer. He used an analogy, so a kind of a story, to illustrate his point that we call the watchmaker analogy. He says that if we looked inside a pocket watch that we'd found on the floor, we would observe all the different parts, the nuts, the bolts, the wheels, the cogs, all the things that are perfectly put together for the purpose of telling the time. And so when you look at that, it's different to looking at a rock, which you could assume has been there for a very long time, or has always been there. If you look at the inside of a pocket watch, you would assume it's been put together by a person, by an intelligent person, and it's been put together for a purpose. And he said you would correctly assume a designer that is a watchmaker. So in the same way, he says, if we look at different parts of the natural world, so for example, I've put a dandelion clock there. There's a lot of them around recently. My kids love picking them and blowing them. And it's amazing to see all of those little seeds with their own little parachutes being taken off as far as they can possibly go to spread and to be able to plant new dandelions. And some people would look at that and consider it a clever design feature. And so what William Paley said is that if you observe any part of any living thing, you would also see these kind of intricate features of design. So for example, if we look at a human eye and all of the parts that work together in order to fulfill a purpose of giving us sight, we could also assume a designer. And in that case, he calls it a divine watchmaker, and that's what he means by God. So what's the argument against this? Well, I think this is quite an easy one. In scientific times, we can see that actually those so-called design features are actually products of evolution and adaptation. So Charles Darwin, who wrote kind of the first book on evolution, noticed that things over millions of years had adapted bit by bit to their environment, and they'd adapted in this kind of process in order to be better at what they needed to do and to survive. And sometimes that's called survival of the fittest, that things need to change in order to adapt and survive. And so over millions of years, they've created for themselves these little features that we might look at and see design. And Richard Dawkins is a famous philosopher and scientist, an atheist today. And he would kind of follow that argument that it is the appearance of design without a designer. Another philosophical argument is the cosmological argument, and the philosopher behind this one is St. Thomas Aquinas. And he came up with these three ways, these three different arguments for the existence of God. And all of them come from what he observed about the world we live in, but also about the universe. So he called those ways motion, cause, and contingency. What he meant by that, the way of motion, is he observed that everything in the universe is in a state of movement or change. And so he said that there must be one thing that does not move or change, one thing that kind of keeps everything else in motion, but is itself unmoved. And he called that the unmoved mover, and he meant God. The second way, the way of cause, said that everything in the universe is part of this chain of cause and effect. And so we can see that one thing is caused by something that came before it, which is caused by something else. But he says you can't go back for infinity. There has to be something that started that chain of reactions off. There has to be a cause that doesn't itself need to be caused, that doesn't rely on anything else for its existence. And he calls that the first cause, and by that he means God. And the third way is the way of contingency. So this one was a bit trickier. Contingent things are things that rely on something else for their existence. So it's really similar to the second point, the way of cause. So I'm a contingent being, you're a contingent being. The sunflowers that I've planted are contingent because they started as seeds. They could have remained seeds. They could become sunflowers. They could become bird food. Who knows what's going to happen to them? They're contingent. They rely on me looking after them. They rely on soil, on oxygen, on rain, on sun. So they are contingent beings. And Thomas Aquinas said that everything in the universe, in fact, is contingent because although it exists, it also could have not existed. And at some point in time, it will cease to exist. So he said there must be something that is a necessary being. And a necessary being would be a being that must exist and cannot not exist. And that is what he calls God. So the history arguments of why God must exist. And of course, again, we're going to science for our counter arguments for that. This is what an atheist would say, or a humanist, someone with a non-religious worldview. They would say that science explains what caused the universe, what keeps it in motion, why we have cause and effect. And they would go to the argument, the theory of the Big Bang, as the beginning of everything. Of course, there are Christian arguments that kind of go back against that, and they would say that even though the universe maybe started with the Big Bang, it was God that caused the Big Bang. Other people would say, well, we don't need to believe there was a cause to the universe. We could just say that it goes back for infinity. Why not? You know, there's no proof either way. Okay, final topic for this unit is religious upbringing. And this is so different to the ones that come before it, so it's kind of just tagged on the end. But it is a reason why lots of people believe in God today, because they were raised to believe in God. So religious upbringing is where parents raise their children to follow a particular religion. And this is encouraged in Christianity, as in most religions, really. People who have a religion often believe they should raise their children to follow that religion as well. A source of wisdom for this one would be from the Bible, which it says in Proverbs, start children off on the way they should go, and even when they're old, they will not turn from it. So that what that's saying is, if you raise children in a certain way, and you teach them this is the right way to do things, even in old age, they will still hold those values. They'll still consider that the right way to do things. And if you do sociology, some of you do, we might think about how people are conditioned by their upbringing to believe certain things. And that would be maybe a different perspective on this. So, some features of a religious upbringing then. So what does that actually look like? What does it mean? Might include baptizing your child as a baby, taking children to church, and for children to go and be part of something like Sunday school on a Sunday morning, maybe when they're a little bit older, confirmation, maybe reading the Bible together at home, praying at home. Christian parents might choose to send their children to a church school as they're getting older. Maybe as they become teenagers, they might attend youth groups at that church. If they've been baptized, then they'll have godparents, so not just their own parents, but other trusted adults who believe the same thing. And being brought up and taught religious kind of codes of conduct, religious rules like the 10 Commandments, and that being kind of an expectation or a value that they have. So there are lots of things throughout a person's childhood that would kind of instill these Christian values. And it creates a really kind of strong sense of identity and belonging and community in a person's life that actually then become comforting things and things that they don't really want to leave. So that green bit should be later. So look at the blue box first. It says people with a religious upbringing are likely to continue following that religion as it's comfortable. So if you think about all of those features that take someone from birth into their teenage years, think about somebody who's about to leave home, maybe go away to university, move to a different city. If they've been brought up going to church every Sunday, then one thing they might do when they move to a new city is find a church to belong to, because they're so used to that community of people that they have things in common with. And so then as adults, they are mirroring that same kind of way of life that they've had all of their childhood. And they trust the adults that raised them. And so if they taught them this is the right thing to do, or this is what we believe, then those things are going to be very strong influences in their life. However, there are suggestions that actually religious upbringing might do the opposite. It might kind of turn people away from religion or faith. That's maybe because people might grow up and have a negative view of religion. They might see it as something that stops them being able to do the things they want to do, or stops them being able to join in with their friends. They might consider some Christian adults they know to be hypocritical and therefore not want to be like them. So a religious upbringing can have a positive and a negative impact on somebody's beliefs and religion as they grow up. Right. So that's the 8 topics that form the unit of arguments for the existence of God. And there's a few things just to pick up on that kind of link all of those together. First of all, does God exist? And are any of those things enough evidence that prove God's existence? The second kind of thing, that the theme that runs through those, is what is God like? What's God's nature? What do Christians learn about God through those? So, for example, the cosmological argument might teach them that God is powerful, that he's able to create such amazing things from nothing. Things like miracles might teach them that God is loving because God has compassion for people who are ill and wants to make them better. God answering prayers teaches them that God hears them and God is listening. So all of those things that we looked at, they give evidence that God exists, but they also say something about God's nature. So how do we put this together in an assessment? Just for today's assessment, we're going to suggest that you use 30 minutes, which is a little bit longer than you would get in the final exam for one full question. The one that we're giving you today is 24 marks, because we're not going to give extra marks for SPAG on this one. If you have extra time, you get 37 minutes. It's actually 37.5 minutes. So, you know, some of you might want to challenge yourselves today and time yourself and see how well you do in writing. It works out roughly as a mark per minute if you also want to give yourself 5 minutes to check, which we would recommend you do. So just a quick reminder, for part A, you will be asked to state 3 things. This is not the question you'll get today. I'll show you those at the end. This is just an example from a different topic. So question A will say state 3 something. Now we've talked in the past about whether or not you can bullet point these. And what me and Mrs. Lawrence are saying now is we'd like you to try and give 3 short sentences where possible, just to give as full an answer as possible. Remember how many marks each question is worth, so look at that. It's in brackets after the question. So you don't need to spend a long time on this one at all, because it's only worth 3 marks. So 3, make sure you're saying 3 separate things, not the same thing in 3 different ways. Okay, part B asks you to explain 2 reasons for something, or give 2 examples of something. And so what I'd say for this is two very short paragraphs with a point and an explanation for each. So think about the first 2 parts of a Peel paragraph: point, explanation, point, explanation. Yeah, just to explain 2 things about the topic that you've been learning. Part C is exactly like part B. It asks for 2 explanations or 2 examples of something, but it will also say that in your answer you must refer to a source of wisdom and authority, and that's where the extra mark comes from. So part B is worth 4 marks, part C is worth 5, because it wants you to give a source of wisdom. So it could be a quote, but remember, you could paraphrase it. You don't need to know exactly where in the Bible it comes from. So you could just say something like, in the Bible there is a story about a prophet called Moses who heard from God. Or it could say, in the Bible Jesus says that unless people see miracles, they won't believe in him. So feel free to paraphrase, as long as we can see what you're talking about, that's fine. In this unit, sources of authority could also be philosophers. So William Paley with the design argument, Thomas Aquinas with the cosmological argument, critics like David Hume, Richard Dawkins, Charles Darwin. So talking about those people would also count as a source of wisdom and authority. Okay, and then it's the big one, D question. So we would recommend you spend about 15 minutes on the question. So spend half of your time on part D because it's worth half the marks. Sometimes a D question is worth 15 marks because there's 3 SPAG marks available. We're not going to do that today, so we're just going to give 12 marks for this one. And you will be given a statement, and then you need to evaluate the statement showing 2 points of view and your own response, which is a justified conclusion. So we would recommend 4 paragraphs for this, which would be an introduction, a paragraph that has arguments to support the statement, a paragraph that has arguments to support a different view, and a conclusion. And so for this unit, it's often going to be paragraph 2 would be kind of the Christian response, and paragraph 3 might be the scientific or atheist or humanist response. In each of those middle paragraphs, try and use sources of wisdom and authority, give really full explanations, use as many key terms or kind of philosophers and names as you can. Try and quickly plan out each paragraph before you write it. Yeah, and that should be kind of well structured in 4 paragraphs, putting in as much information as you possibly can. Okay, so don't forget to incorporate your subject-specific terms to show your understanding. Focus on SPAG on D questions. Answer every question. Don't leave questions blank. If you need to, skip one and then come back to it at the end. And especially D questions, take some time to organise your response clearly. You've got this. I thought you'd like that. And these are your questions for your assessment today. So part A says outline 3 types of religious experience. Part B is asking you to explain 2 reasons why the design argument may be important to Christians. Part C is asking you to explain 2 reasons why prayer is important to Christians, and you need to refer to a source of wisdom and authority. And your big question, part D, says miracles are the most important reason which Christians have for following Christianity. And you need to evaluate that statement. And there's 3 things it's asking you to do: argue for and against. You must give a Christian teaching and refer to a non-religious point of view. And for that, I would say humanism would be a good non-religious worldview. And you need to reach a conclusion which follows your argument. Okay, good luck. We look forward to reading them and we'll get feedback to you as soon as possible. I hope you found this video helpful and hopefully some more to come. See you soon.